So I'll be explaining why it's a good idea for kids to be reading fairy tales, because there's a lot of material out there. They can choose anything to read, so why fairy tales? Number one, it's because especially young children, those are the kind of stories that they're interested in. When you ask a kid to go and choose a book that they want to read, probably they're going to choose something with animals or magic in it, and those are the kind of things that show up in fairy tales. So kids are just naturally interested in those types of stories. In addition, fairy tales are relatively short, so that's less intimidating for a child when they're looking for a book to read, if they're going to read it on their own, or if they want somebody to read it to them. They want something that they can get through in one sitting, in a relatively short time. So when my kids are choosing books for me to read to them, they'll bring me 2 or 3 fairy tales to read at one sitting. In addition, just what kids can learn from the fairy tales that they're reading is another big benefit for them, because these fairy tales have been around for a long time. Everybody's kind of read them. They know the lessons and the morals in the stories. So it helps when kids read them to develop a common mythology that everybody else knows. When they're reading the fairy tales, they're learning about those things that everybody else has heard of. And when you meet somebody who actually doesn't know one of the common fairy tales, you kind of wonder what happened to them in their education. Why didn't they learn about this somewhere? Maybe they read about it, maybe they learn about it from Disney. But actually, the Disney versions of the fairy tales are not always the original ones. So when kids get a chance to actually read the original stories, they can compare that to what they've seen in the Disney movie. And then that also just adds to their knowledge base and helps them later when they're reading other more mature material where a writer refers back to a fairy tale. If they know the original, then they can get a deeper understanding of what it is they're reading. And especially literature tests and SAT tests, when students can understand this common mythology and questions are asked about that, that actually helps raise their test scores as well. And finally, a third reason why fairy tales are good for kids to read, it's because the language that's in them, a lot of those phrases and the kind of language that they meet in the fairy tales is actually very common in English. For example, the lessons from Aesop's fables, don't count your chickens before they hatch, slow and steady wins a race. These kinds of expressions are very common in English, so when kids can encounter them in the fairy tale or the Aesop fable, and then it's also explained there for them, so they can understand what it is that phrase means, and they have exposure to the language itself. So there are lots of other reasons also why fairy tales are good for kids, but these are just a couple of reasons, and I hope you enjoy reading the ones that we've developed in this series.